Okay, let's do it. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, everyone. We're so glad that you're with us today. Welcome to the Council of the Americas. I'm Steve Liston, Senior Director at the Council of the Americas in Washington, D.C. Among other duties, I manage the Council's Trade Advisory Group, and so I have the pleasure of serving as moderator for today's virtual panel on trade and the environment. Today, with the help of a fantastic panel of experts, we're going to explore this rapidly evolving topic, the latest developments and discussions at a global level, and what they all mean for companies and policymakers in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I want to thank all of our council members who have joined us today for this webinar, and especially the members of our Trade Advisory Group, and special thanks to our sponsor for today's program, Amazon. I am pleased now to introduce our panelists. Annabelle Gonzalez is Deputy Director General at the World Trade Organization in Geneva and a former Minister of Foreign Trade of Costa Rica. Welcome, Annabelle, and thank you for being with us today. Dr. William Maloney has nearly 25 years of experience working on Latin America at the World Bank and now serves as Chief Economist for the Latin America and Caribbean region at the World Bank. Most importantly, Bill has his PhD in economics from UC Berkeley, my alma mater. Welcome, Bill, and go Bears. Nigel Purvis is the CEO of Climate Advisors and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Oceans and International Environment and Science at the State Department. He is an advisor to the Climate Leadership Council's new Center for Climate and Trade, and had to put up with me many years ago when we were both advisors to the Undersecretary for Global Affairs. Nigel, I really appreciate you making time for us today. So these brief introductions don't begin to do justice to this distinguished panel, but their bios are on our website, and I want to devote all of our attention to what they have to say. So without further delay, let's get to it. I'd like to start by asking all three of you for a general comment about the topic of trade and environment, trade and climate change, which is sort of taking over that topic. The WTO has had a Trade and Environment Committee since 1995, but for many of us, the topic seems to have kind of burst onto the scene all of a sudden. The connection between trade and environment isn't always obvious to everyone, and there have been a lot of developments over a short period of time. So I'd like to ask each of you to comment on what, from your perspective, are the key things we all should know about the current global discussions on trade and the environment, and then perhaps highlight those that are most relevant to Latin America and the Caribbean, to the policymakers in those countries, and to companies that are working in the region. So Annabelle, let's start with you.
So thank you very much, Steve. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, with Bill, and with Nigel to discuss this important topic. And let me say three key reasons why we must pay close attention to the topic of trade and environment. First, trade is a very powerful tool for climate adaptation and climate mitigation. So on the mitigation side, trade has been one of the success stories of the renewable energy revolution over the past 2 decades. The dramatic fall in the cost of solar and wind energy and the sharp increase in renewable energy capacity around the world actually owes much to trade and the emergence of a globally integrated supply chain in renewable energy. So going forward, I think it's important for policymakers to pay close attention to the barriers that may hinder the emergence of production networks in the clean technologies of the future, because it's important to replicate the success that we've already had with the earlier technologies in this area. On climate adaptation, I think this is a key priority for the region, especially for the Caribbean. 8 Caribbean nations are among the top 20 globally in losses as a percentage of GDP caused by extreme weather events in the past 2 decades. So for these countries, and quite frankly, many others, trade is and will continue to be a lifeline to access the food and supplies from abroad that are needed for the reconstruction and recovery following a natural disaster. And what's more, if you think about agricultural productivity, then it is expected to decrease in some parts of the world due to rising temperatures, increasing aridity, and others. This also means that trade will become increasingly important, to bring food from surplus areas to areas of deficit and to prevent hunger. So there's one reason. A second reason is that, it's important to make sure that trade and climate policies pull in the same direction and not in opposite directions, because that wrong trade policies can set back efforts to achieve climate or other environmental objectives. And the fact is that trade policies in many countries are biased in favor of dirty and against clean industries. And in a way, trade policies are implicitly subsidizing CO2 emissions at a time when policies should be doing exactly the opposite. So I think that is something that needs to change fast, and this is something that we need to pay attention, because better coordinated and integrated trade and environmental policies are absolutely critical. And my third point on why we must pay close attention to trade and environmental policies is that climate change poses big challenges to the operation of global supply chains. And it's not only, of course, because more frequent weather events impact world trade and logistics infrastructure, but it's also because decarbonizing maritime and air transport will be expensive. And this will affect the calculus by businesses on how to reconfigure their supply chains to strike a better balance, if you wish, between efficiency and risk, and just in time and just in case. So let me quickly move to a second point, which is what is happening in terms of key developments in trade and environment. And here I want to highlight two interrelated trends. The first is that more and more countries are relying on trade measures to advance climate and environmental goals. And that is, of course, very much welcome. But it's also important to manage risks, because here the proliferation of different carbon border adjustments and other measures, for example, across countries, risk causing trade fragmentation and even trade friction. And this is something that we can discuss further on. At the same time, it's also important to say that the adoption of climate and other environmental measures is creating new market and trade opportunities for business in Latin America and the Caribbean. And here I think, Bill and the team at the World Bank recently published a great report where they identify some of these opportunities for Latin America and the Caribbean. And I think to seize these opportunities, it is important that green business models gain a greater foothold in Latin America and the Caribbean. And here, paying attention to improving the business climate so that this new, green business models can expand and flourish in the region is important. And I want to conclude by saying that trade policy is a big part of making this happen, because many green business models increasingly rely, for example, on digital tools, access to services inputs, and compliance with sustainability standards to create value. So trade officials can help these business models take root by reducing trade barriers in digital and in services, along with policies that strengthen countries' standards infrastructure. So with that, let me just say that the WTO provides Latin America and Caribbean countries many opportunities to use trade policies proactively in support of their respective green agendas, and to reap the benefits of a low carbon economy for green jobs, green exports, green investment. And I hope that we can discuss a little bit more these issues during this webinar. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much, Annabelle. That's a great introduction in the sense that there's pros, there's cons, there's there's a lot of elements to this topic that companies and policymakers need to be aware of. And you did a great introduction for Bill, who I'm going to open the floor to next, I will just say that Bill's report is called Consolidating the Recovery, Seizing Green Growth Opportunities, and it deals with all these issues that we've discussed. And I'm going to drop the link into the chat for those who are in the webinar with us, so that if you want to attach the link, you can. So Bill, over to you.
Thanks, Steve, and great to be on this panel with Annabelle and Nigel, who I don't know that I know yet, but Annabelle and I go way back. And thanks very much for mentioning our last publication. I just want to set the stage a little bit on three broad points that I think to provide the context for this discussion, which are very much in line with what Annabelle was just saying. The first thing is the region is not doing especially well, either in terms of growth or in terms of trade. If you look at what we're forecasting for the next couple of years, it's on the order of 2.3, 2.2%. And that's basically taking us back to the growth rates of the 2010s, when we were roughly at 2.2%, when the rest of the world was growing at 3.1%. So we have a serious growth problem and a serious productivity growth problem, which I think is anchored in our general problems in adopting new technologies and in getting a business climate that's favorable to productivity growth and growth in general. And I think that's important to keep as a backdrop. The second contextual thing is that you're right. It seems like the region has suddenly become much more attentive to issues of climate change. Although the more you travel in the region, the more you realize that people have been thinking about a lot of these issues for a while. It's just they're coming to the surface. So, but lack is not a big contributor overall to climate change. We're about 8% of global greenhouse gases, and they're really concentrated in the agricultural sector largely. Agricultural, livestock emissions and forest use, which we know is important. But the implications for the region, and here there's some important intersections with trade. But on the first point, we're kind of it's possible that somewhere between 2 and 5.5 million people will be pushed into poverty by 2030, partly as a result of the kinds of things that Annabelle was talking about: extreme weather events, disasters, health issues, labor productivity falls. But then on the production side, we're 90% rain fed in the region. So most countries will see some problems in agricultural output. And that has been a major source of exports for us. And some countries this year have been able to take advantage of the circumstances in the Ukraine, but over the longer term, we're going to have issues there. Just to put a number on what Annabelle was saying about extreme weather events, we estimate something like 1.7% loss every year of GDP loss every year in infrastructure damage. And of course, that's unevenly spread across the region, with the Caribbean taking the brunt of it. But when you consider the region as a whole is spending somewhere around 1.5% on infrastructure, and infrastructure is critical to increasing our trade, then you can see that this is a major problem in terms of trade costs for us. And the final thing I'll mention, just in terms of challenges we face, are that, and Annabelle can elaborate on this, she's more of an expert, but the carbon border adjustment measures that are being considered in Europe are going to require us to green our exports, and that will require, again, all these issues of agriculture and climate smart agriculture and all will be important challenges. But the good thing, the positive thing I just want to leave us with in this first section is that the region has tremendous green comparative advantage that sets us up very well for having the green revolution globally, if you will, be a driver of growth for us, instead of, the concern is that by having to have our industry adjust to stricter climate standards, that's going to be a further drag on growth. And there will be some of that, and we have to be honest about that. But LAC has tremendous opportunities for taking advantage of the change in global attitudes towards the environment. Our electricity matrix is one of the cleanest in the world, with roughly 50% of our matrix being driven by renewables. We have tremendous potential in wind, solar, geothermal, and in green hydrogen. If you look at Patagonia, you look at the Andean region, the potential for wind is huge. If you look at the various deserts we have in the north of Mexico or in the north of Chile, south of Peru, we have tremendous potential for solar. And if to the degree that we can capture this in green hydrogen, that promises possibility of a pretty dynamic export sector. Just in terms of inputs for the green revolution, we have 58% of the global lithium reserves for batteries. There's a very active bidding in the region for business there. And we have 48% of global copper reserves. That situates us very well. And the question is going to be, again, are we going to actually leverage this for a broader diversification of our production and exports, or whether we're just going to extract? That's a larger question the region has struggled with for a century. But we're also incredibly rich in natural capital. We have something like 50% of global biodiversity, of forests and water and the like. And some of this can be, aside from the tourist possibilities and all, some of this can be reconfigured to be exports of environmental services, for instance, in carbon sinks. So there is a huge agenda, I would say a parallel agenda, in both the greening of our industries and the greening of our exports, and also growth. And I think that goes both through improving the environment in which our firms are operating. And this gets into all these issues of business climate, but also the issues of deep trade agreements. And that's another report that I think Steve mentioned somewhere that Annabelle was closely involved with, but that will facilitate exports of all types, but particularly here. And the second dimension is on innovation. We are not good at adopting new technologies in the region. We are badly configured in many ways, and we don't spend a lot on it. Our educational system is not supporting it. And this is critical not only for getting our productivity up, but it's also critical for the green agenda, because the green agenda is fundamentally a technology adoption agenda across the board. And if we're going to take advantage of our green comparative advantage, we're going to have to make progress both on improving the climate in which firms work, but also in terms of improving our capabilities for adapting new technologies. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill. I appreciate that. And I'm hearing again that this issue has both challenges and opportunities if countries are willing to invest in them and seize them. And you've added some more things that Annabelle mentioned, innovation and so on. So I want to turn to Nigel now, just to give us the overview from his perspective. But I also want to mention that the Center for Climate and Trade that he advises also just issued a report called The Case for Climate and Trade. And I'm going to drop that link into the chat as well. So Nigel, let's turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Steve. And thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be here with Bill and with Annabelle. Our comments are quite aligned, partly for that reason and partly because I'm a climate specialist. I'm going to focus on the climate dimension of this environment and trade linkage. From an environmental perspective, aligning the trade and the climate agendas is absolutely essential for climate success. Roughly 25% of global GDP is and climate pollution, 25% of global climate pollution is involved in international trade. And so there is no success on climate without decarbonizing that element of the carbon picture. The developing countries, including developing countries in the Americas and the Caribbean, have an enormous amount to gain from aligning the climate and trade agendas, not only because of the economic opportunities that are created, which I'll speak about more later, but because failing to do so will exacerbate the adverse impacts of climate change, which will fall most on the poor and on developing countries. So this is something that we must do. And it's also something that, unfortunately, we must do very quickly. The scientific community has told us that we have really this next decade. It is the critical decade to dramatically increase climate action. And we won't be able to do that as sufficiently to get on track to meet global climate goals unless we are making inroads in harmonizing the trade and climate agendas. What's happening in the WTO has significant potential. I look forward to hearing from Annabelle in her comments more about where progress can be is possible in the over the next few years. UN climate negotiations are absolutely essential and need to continue, but those two fora need to be supplemented by additional efforts from countries who are particularly concerned about climate change in order to make sure that we are racing forward rapidly. And there are a number of countries who are taking action, and I want to just highlight a few specifics. So the European Union, as has been mentioned, is putting in place a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will try and ensure that imports into the European Union do not undermine European climate measures. German Chancellor Scholz, who's the current chair of the G7, has proposed a climate alliance, which he sees as an opportunity to promote sustainable development through climate and trade action that's coordinated across both developed and developing countries. Precisely what that means in practice is not yet clear, but there's clearly a desire on the part of the German G7 presidency to align the climate and trade agendas, and to look forward in the June G7 for further statements about what those countries will be bringing to the broader international community in this area. Congress in the United States is also taking action. There are active discussions right now, including just this week, between Democrats and Republicans in the Senate about how to find common ground on energy and environment. And included in those discussions, reportedly, are measures that would also adopt some kind of border adjustment system for the United States that would impose fees on high carbon goods coming into this country. In addition, of particular relevance for the Latin American community is the concern that Congress has about the United States inadvertently contributing to deforestation in the Amazon region in particular, but really around the world. And there are measures being introduced by senators and congressmen that would dramatically increase foreign assistance to developing countries who are protecting their forests, but also other bills that would exclude the agricultural products that are grown on land that was cleared illegally under local law in any country of origin, and supporting efforts to enforce existing forest conservation measures in Latin America could be a major contribution that the United States would play. Right now, one cannot import into the United States illegally harvested timber, but one can burn the forest and grow crops and bring those crops into the United States. And it's that disparate treatment, that loophole, environmentalists would say, that Congress is considering closing, which would have a significant impact on trade across the Americas. In addition, the Biden administration has proposed, its Securities and Exchange Commission has proposed that companies that are registered in the United States under securities laws and publicly traded companies would be required to report on their connection to climate change and climate pollution. And that would include what's known as Scope 3 emissions, which are the emissions that are within the supply chain of a company. So again, agricultural commodities grown in Latin America, to the extent that they are contributing to deforestation, that would be disclosed by American companies. And of course, disclosure creates pressure for action. And therefore, one ought to see that the US financial community, the US companies would be increasingly concerned about eliminating deforestation from their corporate supply chains when it's material enough to disclose under these new Biden administration securities regulations, which will be finalized later in the year. So there's a lot happening. I wanted to say a word about why it's happening. So there's clearly a desire to raise climate ambition. There's a desire to prevent what technical people call carbon leakage, which is the idea that there might be offshoring of capacity of manufacturing and production to countries that are not taking action on climate change. and that would be bad for the environment. There's also a desire to create a level playing field for a fair competition so that countries that are taking climate action are not at an unfair advantage, or companies within them are not at an unfair disadvantage compared to international competitors. But I will also say that there are protectionist elements within the different political bodies, both in the United States and in Europe. And so there's a risk that the environment will be used as part of a broader protectionist agenda that is unrelated to the desire to just create a level playing field and ensure the effectiveness of environmental statutes. And so I think our US trading partners in the Americas need to be aware of that and need to be quite engaged in the policy process where appropriate in Europe and in the United States. There are tremendous opportunities for the Americas as relatively clean economies. We see the potential for green products to have enhanced market access into these consumer countries in the United States and in Europe and Canada and other OECD nations. But there's also risk that there could be an exclusion of commodities, agricultural commodities in particular, that are not grown in manners that are pro-forest and pro-environment. So this is something that countries in the Americas and the Caribbean should be paying close attention to. I look forward to talking a little bit more in the Q&A about how we get it right, but I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nigel. And I want to stick with you, but and I want to go back and drill down on some of the things that all three of you mentioned. But before we do that, I do want to invite those who are in the webinar with us. If you have a question, you can use the Q&A function and at the bottom of your screen. And if you want me to identify you, please include your name and your affiliation, and I'll be happy to take those as I can. I want to drill down, Nigel, you mentioned it, this potential, there are those, particularly in our region, who see all this stuff as really just protectionism by other means, right? That as the G7, as the EU look at these measures, that really, they've had all the advantages. They've been able to develop as they want. They've been able to freely develop their industries. And now they're going to turn the clamps on all these countries that don't have these resources, that don't have the ability to do it. I will note the report that the Center for Climate and Trade put out mentioned the importance of not sort of penalizing those countries that simply don't have the resources, and many of them to actually implement these things. And many of them don't. They're really struggling, especially as we come out of a pandemic. So I want to ask all three of you, and Nigel, I'm going to put you on the spot first, just you mentioned it, but Annabelle mentioned as well, but I want to go back through all three and just ask, what do you say to these countries that are saying this is just protectionism? This is nothing more than that. This is just the rich guys making the rules to suit themselves once again. How do you respond? What really is the answer to that question? Nigel.
Well, developing countries have the most to lose if the world doesn't take climate change sufficiently seriously. So we acting on climate change is pro-development, and we shouldn't forget that. But it's absolutely important that we do it right, and that means doing it in a collaborative, inclusive, equitable manner. Some have argued for what they call a climate club or a carbon club, and I think that sends that name sends the wrong signal. It does suggest that it's going to be the rich countries who can afford to decarbonize quickly who are going to be trading among themselves in a much more of a less of a global trade pattern and a much more restricted set of alliances. I think we need to work hard against that idea. And I really like the framing that the German chancellor has given, which is a climate alliance, which the way he's described it includes economic investments and capacity building and the foreign assistance for countries to ensure that they have the technology and the capacity, the data and information necessary to participate in an international trade regime that is going to be looking at whether goods are clean or not. So this is something I think we don't have the option of ignoring it. We need to move towards cleaner and greener trade, but we have to do so in an inclusive and equitable manner that where all countries can benefit and there's really an opportunity.
Thanks, Nigel. Bill, what's your answer to that conundrum? You deal with these countries in the region all the time. I'm sure you hear these arguments from some policymakers. How do you respond to that?
So, a lot of the way you set up the question is fair, but the fact of the matter is, as Nigel was saying, LAC is disproportionately affected compared to its contribution to global warming. So it has every interest in helping the world decarbonize as quickly as possible. That said, the potential for protection, for hidden protectionism is there, and that reinforces the need to have a clear, transparent, rules-based system on this. And I would say on our side of setting up institutions, and it could be in the context of these deep trade agreements that I mentioned earlier, where again, our agreements with the countries we export to make it very clear the kinds of institutions that are needed to certify that our goods meet their restrictions on carbon content or environmental friendliness, and so that these don't wind up being another barrier to trade. It's important to note again that our region under exports, given their free trade agreements, and we're under integrated in supply chains, given the possibilities. So there's a lot of work to do on our end as well, to take advantage of the opportunities that are already there. So I think being sure that these restrictions are done in a transparent and systematic way, and that we're on our end making progress in terms of both the institutional side and on the innovation side, it can work okay.
Thanks very much for that, Annabelle. What you swim in this every day, I'm quite sure, as at the WTO. How do you respond to those who say this is just protectionism?
Steve, I think the impact of climate measures on trade is a pressing issue for Latin America and the Caribbean, for all the reasons that have been mentioned, but also because it is true that there is a rapid proliferation of climate measures around the world, and this could potentially impact the region's exports. So the data here at the WTO shows, for example, that governments are increasingly using these measures to address climate and environmental goals. For example, between 2009 to 2019, governments notified to the WTO more than 4,300 trade measures to address climate change. And this range, from energy efficiency requirements for household goods to tax concessions and other forms of government support for renewable energy plants, and from low carbon labeling schemes for food to bans on inefficient light bulbs, and a whole plethora of measures. Carbon border adjustments are, of course, another example of a trade-related climate measure that has received a lot of attention recently as the European Union and several other countries move towards adopting them. So I think I have to say first that efforts to put in place measures to fight climate change are needed and welcome. But of course, many developing countries fear, as you rightly stated, that they may be used as a pretext for protectionism against their exports, which could weaken global cooperation on climate at a time where it's needed the most. So the WTO has a set of rules that seek to avoid precisely such an outcome. And these rules range, from measures in the area of technical barriers to trade, sanitary and phytosanitary conditions, rules in the area of trading goods more generally, and others. So in a way, the WTO offers an opportunity for governments, to have discussions on the implication of these climate measures, and also to work through many of the challenges that they may bring about, particularly when thinking about their implementation, including things like the tricky issue of measuring carbon intensity of imports in practice. So this is to say that this can be a very important forum because of the rules and because of the dialogue opportunities that it provides. In the absence of this, I fear that this will indeed create trade frictions, which may end up then, having to be sorted out here in the WTO rather than, doing it at the beginning, doing it a little bit at the end. Now, as I think as Bill was saying, there are also important measures that governments can take individually or in the context of their trade agreements. And one of which I would like to highlight is the strengthening of the quality infrastructure in many Latin American countries to be able to support businesses to take the advantage of the opportunities that this may create.
Thanks much for that, Annabelle. In fact, you opened up. I want to go back to Bill for a minute on something that your recent report highlights and that you mentioned, which is that that the region, the Latin America and the Caribbean, has stocks of some of these key minerals that are actually really important for the technologies that are going to power both the green transition and the digital transformation that our economies are all going through. Lithium, copper. I think I read 60% of lithium is in the region. Yeah. And then, but also that some other key commodities like oil and gas may become what you called stranded assets as the transition to green technologies continues. So I'm wondering if you could tell us how you see this new set of factors affecting regional trade in the near and the longer term.
Taking it from the end, these other exports, I mean, right now, for instance, gas and oil are getting a lot of attention, and those are areas where some countries in the region have comparative advantage. And that's a bit of a tricky line to walk in the sense that in the short run, these are very valuable as a transition fuel. Frequently with green technologies, you need another source to complement them when the wind is down or when the sun goes down. And if that's coal, then that's dirty. If it's natural gas, it's less dirty, right? And there are many cases in which natural gas, for instance, will be a transition fuel. The problem is exactly what you say. First of all, there's natural gas tends to be co-produced with oil, and the future of oil is in doubt over the medium term. So you want to avoid heavily investing in an industry that's going to be gone in 20 years. So that's exactly the question of stranded assets you have. The other thing is you don't want to be having, for instance, your urban infrastructure built around natural gas, transport infrastructure built around natural gas, when hydrogen might be a better source over the longer term. So there's this kind of path dependency issue that we really have to be careful about. On the other hand, this is wealth right now, and prices are high, and so over the medium term, we have to manage those things carefully. I do think that we're going to see increased exports of lithium and of copper going forward. Prices will remain high for those things. Again, the question is, though, how do we avoid just being dependent on some foreign firms coming in and taking lithium? Some countries are very involved in getting their local industries involved in a constructive way, and that isn't just putting set-asides, or you have to buy a certain amount of inputs from these firms. That's never really worked. It has to be sort of efficiency-driven, productivity-driven, giving them a chance to be input providers, but not mandating it and locking in inefficiencies. And in that sense, I'll draw a tie over to what Annabelle was just saying about raising quality. And there's a whole range of programs that people use around the world to both raise the quality of management for improving productivity, but also the quality of what our local firms produce. And Latin America, in terms of measures of our managerial capabilities, tend to be sort of middle of the road globally, with a lot of room for improvement. So I think the process of diversification and of exploiting these new opportunities is going to require some heavy lifting in that area as well.
Thanks, Bill. It's clear there are countries that have done this successfully, and one of the reasons the World Bank is there, and the IDB and the CAF and others, is to help countries, use what's already been done. Obviously, these are extremely complex issues. So, but governments have a lot to think about. We've been focusing on governments, but I'd like to turn back to Nigel again and to talk a little bit about corporations. Nigel, you work with a lot of companies. You are seeing what companies are doing. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about the trends you're seeing on climate change issues, decarbonization, and so on, from the people you work with, from the companies you work with. What are the things that our members and those companies working in Latin America ought to be aware of and ought to be thinking about from a company perspective?
So the biggest trend from a major corporation perspective is that having a pathway to become carbon neutral as a company, and not just one's own direct emissions, but the entire supply chain that serves the company both up and down, that there needs to be a plan. The company, to be a responsible company, now needs to have a plan for achieving zero net emissions by mid-century. And there have, over the last couple of years, had thousands of major global companies adopt what's called science-based targets. So the idea is that the goals of the Paris Agreement really require the majority of the world to be decarbonized fully by the middle of the century, and companies, to be responsible companies, to have social license to operate globally, need to be aligned with those goals. So these science-based targets that put the companies on a pathway to net zero by mid-century is the first big thing I'd highlight. But as part of that, because it's a process and decarbonization takes time, even when one is being ambitious, there is additional civil society expectation or pressure for these companies to be taking complementary actions, additional investments to show that they are aligning their resources and their influence with climate action. So there's an increased expectation, for example, that companies that have done all they can to reduce their emissions today, but still have remaining emissions, take some action to offset or compensate for those remaining emissions by investing in emissions mitigation opportunities elsewhere. Most of those investments are likely to be outside of the developed world, where in developing countries, and particularly in what's called nature-based solutions or forests, where there are opportunities to conserve and restore forests for a fraction of the cost of decarbonizing the industrial economy. So as a complement to doing what they can, companies are now expected to also invest in sustainable rural development in a way that is helps local communities, supports the rights and interests of indigenous peoples, and generally is advancing the rural sustainable development strategies of developing countries. We are seeing a rapid growth in carbon markets, particularly in the voluntary carbon market, where companies are making these investments, and those trends are likely to continue. So there are opportunities for the region, not just by producing clean products and clean inputs into the clean economy, but by also providing these nature-based solutions to corporate, to major global companies who are increasingly looking for them as a complement to the direct emissions reductions that they are doing within their own operations.
Yeah, thanks. So there's also, I imagine, you mentioned earlier the financing component of this, that financiers are now starting to look at this in company terms as well as country terms. And so Latin American countries, the multi-Latinas we work with and so on, need to be aware of this as well, is that financiers are going to be asking these questions, I assume. It also leads to the question, and I just wanted to ask you quickly if this is an issue of what's called greenwashing, right? That, companies are putting out nice statements and saying nice things about all the stuff they're doing, but that they're not really being held accountable to this necessarily, or that these aren't significant measures. Is that an issue? Is that something that we should be worried about? Is there a way that we can make sure that isn't happening?
Yeah, so it is a concern. A huge number of companies have made commitments to become carbon neutral by mid-century, and the vast majority don't really have a plan or a really clear idea of how they will achieve that. And they're looking for public policies to support them so that they are able to do so efficiently without being at a disadvantage compared to companies that have not made those commitments. So there is some hiding behind of governments. There is some buying some time, and the mix of sincerity and insincerity at this stage is actually very hard to gauge. Most of these commitments are recent, and the work is hard, and so it's not surprising that they don't have everything figured out yet. So civil society and think tanks and governments are increasingly organizing to require disclosure of what, in fact, the plans are, the details of the plans, and what progress is being made. So there'll be, I think, the accountability at the moment is modest, but the accountability will increase. And part of the reason, as you said, Steve, is that investors are organizing, and an increasingly large number of funds are environmentally focused and focused on social and governance issues. Although, in fact, the majority of the new funds created in the United States in the last few years have had these performance criteria, or these screening criteria that require strong environmental performance. So companies seeking to attract investment around the world, countries seeking to attract investment will need to think hard about how they are making themselves attractive to these increasingly green investors, as well as to the companies who are seeking to decarbonize their supply chains in finding local suppliers in the LAC region. Can I just say one other very quick thing, if I could, which I think is really relevant? One of the things that the LAC region needs to watch out for is that maybe Europe and the United States and other developed countries will have the right intention, which is to try and harmonize climate and trade, but they might go about it in a way that could end up being perceived as unfair. And it's important for LAC countries to be vocal about their interests here. Europe, in its carbon border adjustment, is really, although they do provide a little bit of a exception for you to petition that you're clean in other ways, the main idea is that they want every country to have a European style carbon price. And that's going to work for some countries. I'm a supporter of carbon pricing. I think it's economically efficient and makes a lot of sense, but it's not going to be the right policy for every country. In the United States, in Congress is talking about looking at the economic cost of regulation, because the US doesn't have a national carbon price, but we've got lots of regulation. And so let's look at how economically stringent our regulations are. Well, again, regulations might be the right for some policies for some countries in the Latin American region, but not the right policies for others. So I think the right environmental thing is to look at not at policies. Policies are a means to an end. What we want is trade in clean goods. And so policies really should be kind of set aside, and the trade measures should be really looking at whether a good in trade is clean or dirty. And this is, I think, going to be more likely to be beneficial to developing countries who may not have the capacity to adopt certain policies that work in the global north, but are able to, as Bill rightly said, produce important inputs into the clean economy. So really focusing on whether a good is clean is something that I think is in the LAC community's interest. And I would encourage folks to engage with policymakers in the United States and in Europe to make sure the focus is on the right issue.
Thanks, Nigel. You just gave me an opening to go right back to Annabelle on that question. So, we know there have been discussions on trade and environmental sustainability. They're going on. These are important. We know there are new commitments by governments that were made at the climate change conference in Glasgow last year. Where do these things stand? Are these issues that Nigel raises, which are just critical issues for Latin America and the Caribbean, are they part of this discussion? Is there a recognition of how complex these issues are when we start talking about trade, and how are they being addressed in the WTO context? You're on mute, Annabelle.
So, You made the reference at the beginning of this event, Steve, that the WTO has been dealing with trade issues, with environment issues for a while, and that is true. But really, in the past few years, there's been an increase, I think, move from mere sort of coexistence to looking for coherence of trade and environment, from being passive to being proactive, and a little bit more, I think, from moving like from words to deeds. And I think that's the driver of 3 recent initiatives here at the WTO, where members are discussing the linkages between trade and environment. So one is on environmental sustainability, another one is on plastics pollution, and a third one on fossil fuel subsidy reform. And I'll talk a bit on each one of them quickly, but I want to highlight that there are more than 80 WTO members that represent some 85% of global trade, including the US, China, the European Union, of course, certain Latin American countries, of course, that are part of at least one of these initiatives. And actually, Latin American countries are quite active participants and play a leading role in some of them. So the first we've discussed a bit is the impact of climate measures on trade. This is a critical issue. Let me just add quickly here to what Nigel was saying, that an additional source of concern is the fragmentation of all these schemes and carbon pricing mechanisms that are popping up everywhere, because this fragmentation has a cost for business, and that is particularly so in the case of developing countries. So one big issue on the agenda is the impact of climate measures on trade. A second issue is grappling with plastics pollution. And we know that this is a great threat to land and ocean resources and human health. So here WTO members are looking at how to improve transparency, how to align standards to favor recyclability and compostability and create markets for plastic substitutes. Governments are also looking at ideas of lowering trade barriers and taking other steps to facilitate the emergence of reverse supply chains that foster a circular plastics economy, where plastics are used rather than being dumped in rivers or oceans. So this is the beginning of a conversation, because it's really, it's a difficult topic. There's not a lot of data to support the analysis in this area, but I think more will come. And the third is, of course, environmentally harmful subsidies. And here we know that a lot of money is spent not only on fossil fuel subsidies, but also, and this is a topic where the WTO has been working for quite a while, and I am I really think it's important to make progress here, is an agreement that will put an end to harmful fishing subsidies that are prevalent in many parts of the world, that have caused depletion of fish stocks in the oceans, and that it's really badly needed to reverse this situation, but also to protect the lives and livelihoods of many people across the world. So again, I sense not only significant movement in the WTO in these topics, but I think more will come as the issue becomes more pressing in national agendas as well.
Super, thank you. A huge amount of work being done in the WTO, and thank you for telling us just a little bit about it. I know these are enormous discussions. Bill, I want to turn to you. I think we've got just time for one more question before some final comments. And Bill, I'd like to ask you to deepen a little bit your view on what are the key policy areas that governments in the region, in light of all this discussion, ought to be pursuing. What are the big things that they have to do? And then also, we've gotten a question about this idea of creating export services from the carbon sinks, and Nigel mentioned this as well, this idea that you can participate in the green trade and global economy in that way through this offering of carbon sinks. Can you talk a little bit about that as well?
So obviously, the first task for most governments is going to be to mitigate the damage that is being done to large fractions of the population, and this is going to require a lot of adaptation of you can see, particularly in Central America and in the Caribbean, there's a lot of work on strengthening infrastructure to extreme weather events. There's throughout the region, there's going to be issues of people being pushed into poverty. So that's going to remain a key agenda going forward, regrettably. The second thing is just, I would say, the rising awareness needs to accelerate as to the possible challenges that we face in the trade realm. And that's first in terms of, okay, what is our external context going to look like? How are these CBAMs and the like going to affect our exports? And what are we going to have to do and that's going to require effort in terms of establishing transparent and credible institutions, and in terms of establishing procedures, again, perhaps in the context of deep trade agreements that will facilitate, the integration of these new standards into our exports. And the third thing, though, I think, is to take a long-term look at how we're going to leverage the opportunities that we have, and how we're going to leverage them for diverse and dynamic growth, which we've not been successful at in the past. And part of the reasons that the 2010s were a bad decade for Latin America is that commodity prices were, declined across the period, which just goes to show how undiversified we are and how dependent on one particular, export or a couple of exports. We have to lift our game across the board in terms of facilitating the emergence of new firms, in terms of facilitating operation of businesses in our countries, but also in improving our capability to identify, adapt, and implement new technologies in the region. And that is a big task. And it starts, honestly, we've lost 1.5 years of education due to COVID. We have to address that. If you talk to employers in the region, 25 to 35%, 30% say they can't find the skills they need, and that's compared to 20% for the rest of the world, and that includes a lot of parts of the world that are poor. We lack the técnicos y tecnológicos, the mid-level technical people that we need, that businesses need, and our higher education system is incredibly expensive and doesn't generate the kind of technical skills we need. And then taking up a level higher, we have really weak integration between, for instance, our research capabilities and the private sector. And to go back to Annabelle's point, well, I'm twisting it a little bit, but this quality upgrading is really a managerial agenda. We have to, when you listen to entrepreneurs talk about free trade agreements, it's not always, oh, this provides an incredibly big market that we can now exploit. It's often, wow, they're going to take our markets, and it's a defensive thing. It's a lack of confidence in how they can exploit the opportunities that are there. And I think we need to work on all of these dimensions to generate more business dynamism in the region.
Thanks. Thanks. I feel like I've gotten a master's degree. I should get credit for this panel for a master's degree. It's been so great. We're almost out of time. We just got a couple minutes. I want to give each of you one last chance for anything we've missed. And particularly, I feel like it's important that companies and governments are working together on this, and any thoughts you have on that. So let me start with Nigel. Nigel, any last comments for us?
For folks who are policymakers or are engaging the policy process, I would just highlight the opportunity to be part of an expanded trade and sustainable development set of solutions. The world is moving in this direction. Trade and climate will be harmonized, hopefully in a manner completely compatible with the WTO and inside the WTO. But I think Europe and others are proving that they're going to also take additional measures outside of that. And so there's so much happening. There's an opportunity to be a part of it, and there's a risk in getting behind and not being part of the solution, but instead being seen as a provider of dirty products. And so I would really recommend strong engagement and the interests of the community, the voices of the Latin American community and Caribbean need to be heard.
Thanks for that. Bill, last thoughts.
So yeah, I just spoke too long a second ago, but all I'll say is I'm very glad that Annabelle is going to establish these transparent systems of environmental rules going forward that we can work with in the region. And I think we have a lot of challenges, but the potential is huge for us. And it's just a question of getting our ducks aligned in terms of institutions, in terms of business climate, in terms of our capabilities as entrepreneurs and workers to take advantage of them.
Yeah, this topic doesn't exist in isolation from all the other things that have to be done, as you said. Annabelle, you get the last word for us before we close.
Very quickly, it's been a great conversation, Steve. I want to insist on the point of aligning trade policies more closely with climate and environmental goals. Many good points have been made. I want to highlight just one that I think is particularly relevant, which we have not discussed much, which is the importance of reducing trade costs in sectors like digitally enabled services that are essential for emerging green business models and for green exports and green job creation and economic diversification. I do think that it's an area of opportunity for Latin American countries. They can do so at the national level, at the regional level, but certainly at the WTO. There is an important forum where governments can cooperate to reduce trade costs in the area of digitally enabled services.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, we are out of time. And I think we all need to now get a PhD now that we've got our master's degree, because there's obviously a lot more that both companies and policymakers in the region need to understand. And you've got three great panelists we've had today who are all there to help you. So I would look to them if you're want to explore this topic further. Thank you to each of you for joining us today and for opening a dialogue on this topic that we're going to be hearing a lot more about in the next months and years. I'm hoping you'll come back, maybe in person next time, so we can have a good discussion. Thanks again to Amazon, our 2022 Trade Advisory Group sponsor, to all our members who joined today, and to those watching on the webcast. I hope you'll join us for next week's program on financing climate change adaptation as well, which will be webcast from our website that our colleagues at America's Quarterly are doing. And this one will be available. If you haven't had enough, if you want to watch it again, it will be on our website shortly. So thanks to all. Have a great day. We'll look forward to seeing you again at the Council of the Americas.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.